John Broadhurst, Democrat for Congress in District 10. Why are you running for this office?
I'm running for Congress here in the Pennsylvania 10th District because I believe that the Democratic Party has to renew its commitment to progressive reform, shared prosperity, and political accountability.
And before we go any farther, John, which part of Pennsylvania makes up District 10 for the benefit of our viewers statewide?
Yeah, okay. For those not from the district, the Pennsylvania 10th is South Central PA, which people across the state will know. Mechanicsburg, perhaps York, Harrisburg, Carlisle, just a few of the big cities or big towns in the district.
What sets District 10 apart from other parts of Pennsylvania? And I understand that your family has representation around the state.
Well, a couple of things. Yes, it is true. I'm originally from Delaware County, which is outside of the Philadelphia area, but my family has roots really all across the state, from Scranton, Carbon County, Pittsburgh, Carlisle, Harrisburg, etc. Now, what sets this part of the state apart is, I think, historically, it's very interesting because over the past half century, or for a long period, it was the hub of the trucking industry. As you know, this part of the country, South Central, benefited tremendously from investments during the Eisenhower era in infrastructure. And so this is also the way I discovered the district, because I was a truck driver in my early years, working my way through college. And this was my territory.
Now, what were the circumstances that brought you to live in District 10?
Well, as I said, I originally came to the district back when I was a college student. And for about
Was that the reason to go to college here?
No, because I went to school at Villanova, which is just outside of Philadelphia.
Right.
But I worked as a truck driver and delivered trucks and met with mom and pop shops all across the district because of the fact that there were so many repair shops.
Was this your dad's business?
Clients. It was my dad's business. He didn't own the business, but it's a company called Watkins Motors, which is was in Chester.
So what kind of places did you visit and what did you observe there?
Well, a couple of things. I visited mechanics, companies that repair chassis for heavy-duty vehicles. I was driving refrigerated vehicles. Also, retail outlets that were our customers. And I was doing, as a young man, I was doing the road show. So I was the one driving the trucks, meeting with the customers. So it's you get to know a district from the ground up.
What was it like interacting with those people? What kind of concerns what did you learn from them that you could apply to wanting to be a congressman? What do they need? What does business need, especially small business?
Well, I think first thing, small businesses really depend on consumer spending, the consumer market. Generally, small businesses are dependent on consumers within 5 to 10 miles of where they actually exist. So I think this is something you can observe everywhere across the country. And so small businesses need vibrant local economies. And generally, since consumer spending represents about 69–70% of GDP, if you don't have a robust consumer demand, local businesses suffer. Whereas larger corporations, which were able to scale their operations across the country and sometimes across the world, they can sustain themselves, actually, in a better way through the ups and downs of an economic cycle, whereas small businesses really are directly affected.
So bring us up to date in your business experience. In other words, what are you doing to make a living right now?
Well, I'm not making a living right now. I'm running for Congress. And so
is that right? Full-time? So
yes.
Did you have a job before and then you resigned in order to run?
Well, I've always been self-employed.
Well, tell us more about that work.
Yeah, okay. Well, after college, after school at Villanova, where I studied history, I worked for a couple of years in France, working for a small consulting company in New York. And then I lived for about 12 years in Beijing, China. And I was a partner in a small firm that did television syndication production. And in fact, so I've been in many studios like this one today. And my clients were companies like ESPN, the Discovery Channel, Eurosport, the International Olympic Committee, the Weather Channel, and so on and so forth.
So you lived in China for 12 years.
I did.
You must have learned the language.
At one time, I could speak Chinese pretty well. I would say speak good, bad Chinese, put it to you that way.
Just enough Chinese?
Yeah, so if I have to parachute into China one day, I won't starve. But more recently, in terms of business,
yes, please.
To fast forward, my most recent business was in a consulting capacity again, working with someone you may know. His name is Bob Dylan. the singer-songwriter.
Sure.
And so I was part of a team that helped Bob Dylan launch a brand called Heaven's Door whiskey. So if you Google Heaven's Door whiskey today, you'll see it. Yeah.
And is that something that's on the market today?
It is. It is. You can buy it here in the district very easily.
I wonder how Bob Dylan, well, how did you two come together? Did he find out about your business or vice versa? Maybe you solicited the business?
No, I didn't at all, actually. So I'll have to be very truthful. I don't know Bob Dylan personally. We've never met.
Understood.
So, but the CEO of the company Heaven's Door is a former client of mine from a previous business when I was living in China. And so he reached out to me to ask if I would be willing to help him on a small part of the project, which was fundraising and then business development. And so that's how it came about. But prior to that, I don't drink whiskey, and I don't know very much about whiskey, to be honest. But that was how we came together. And I think that's often the case with small businesses. So small businesses are often benefit from word of mouth, from good relationships, from referrals, and so on and so forth.
Right. And sometimes artists diversify in surprising ways.
Exactly.
Let's talk about some of the issues that appeared on your website, the things that are important to you as you wage this campaign for Congress. And one of the first things on your website has to do with climate. And not merely climate change, but you called it climate disaster. So give me an example of what you're talking about.
Well, I think it's first of all, it's important to remind our viewers that the expression climate change is really one that was used by people who initially wanted to deny climate change. So change to most people is a good thing, right? We all change, the world evolves, etc. In my website, I refer to it as a climate disaster because I think there's no escaping the socioeconomic and personal damage done by severe weather. And we know that severe weather conditions are becoming more and more dangerous.
We have more extreme weather events.
Yeah, and the United States is one of the world leaders in socioeconomic damages due to severe weather. And the other leaders are India and China. And this is something that actually I did quite a lot of research 20 years ago, working on a particular project in China. So it's disastrous, and so I therefore call it climate disaster. And we've seen it all across the country. California, Texas, Florida, and southern Florida, as you know, a lot of people can no longer get flood insurance or disaster insurance for severe weather, and that's because they live in danger zones. And so I think we're going to have to deal with this in a very direct and sustained way over the next 20 or 30 years.
So what kind of ideas do you have?
Well, the first thing is to point out is that climate change involves so many different moving parts or components of American life. So agriculture, trade, logistics, distribution, etc. So, but I think more, just very broadly, if I could say that, I think one of the things that we're going to have to, how should I say, use is access to the American market for foreign countries who do not conform to certain standards of environmental protection. So in other words, the United States is one of course, largest consumer markets in the world. And so our trade partners like India, China, for example, need access to the US market. I would like them to also conform to more serious, stringent regulations when it comes to CO2 emissions. So one of the criticisms that many people raise, and rightly so, is that China is the largest emitter of CO2. And so if China is not making a special effort to reduce CO2 emissions, why should we? I would like to flip the narrative and say that China should, and to encourage China to reduce its CO2 emissions, we should make access to the United States market one of the conditions for that.
Here's another point you make on your website. It has to do with fossil fuels. You said that they have entrenched power. So that was an interesting way to characterize that and talk about the significance of that power and how it has effects on alternatives that might come up in the future.
Well, when I use that expression, entrenched power, I'm being very serious. And we all know that finance, or campaign finance, is an extremely important part of the way, one of the important things that we have to reform in order to have government policy which reflects the will and the interests of the people. And the fossil fuel industry has been investing in, quote unquote, public policy now for well over half a century. And so as we begin to make, and we've made a lot of progress in the past 2 years under Joe Biden's leadership, made a lot of progress addressing the climate change and the pivot away from fossil fuels. And the fossil fuel industry, and we have to remind our viewers that the fossil fuel industry is one of the greatest beneficiaries of federal subsidies of any industry in the United States. In fact, without federal subsidies, it's quite possible we don't even have a fossil fuel industry. So the fossil fuel industry isn't paying for lobbyists, trying to slow down the pivot away from fossil fuels. And sometimes they're quite effective. So that's what I mean by entrenched power. But I think I could say the same for other industries, like the pharmaceutical industry, the healthcare industry, all of the companies that are manufacturers of military hardware, software, big tech, Wall Street. All of these are really, to some extent, entrenched industries which have to protect the status quo.
So you mentioned prescription drugs, and of course our viewers are wondering about reducing the cost of prescription drugs. That's on everyone's mind.
Well, it's on everyone's mind because it's such an important part of consumers, I should say, patient spending amongst elderly in particular. So as we know, as we age, our health declines.
You use more resources.
And we use more products. I think the only way to really control this, to control the spiraling inflation in prescription drugs, is to enable the federal government to negotiate with all of the manufacturers of prescription drugs in the same way that is done in France, in Britain, in Germany, in Italy, Spain, Norway, all across Europe. The United States citizens pay a huge premium on all prescription drugs relative to our counterparts in the industrial world. And that's just not sustainable, and there's no reason for it.
Now, what about expanding affordable health care coverage in general? Any ideas in that area?
Well, as you know, the Affordable Health Care Act was a big part of expanding access in the United States under President Obama. If I'm not mistaken, we now have an additional 20 million people joined quite recently. I may have the exact figure wrong, but it was a very impressive number. So I think we still have too many people falling through the cracks. So as we know, we have people who are covered by private employers, by Medicare, Medicaid, and so on and so forth. But we have at any point of the year, you have between 30 and 60 million people who do not have adequate health care coverage. And this has always been a tremendous problem in the United States. And it's one of the things that puts tremendous pressure on working class families.
Any ideas on helping Americans achieve economic security?
I mean, we've lived through, over the past 20 years, 2 economic crises. And I think it's important for our viewers to remind ourselves of this. The first crisis was the Great Recession, the implosion of the market in 2008, and the Great Recession, which lasted too long. The federal government intervened, but not nearly at the same level that it did in 2020, between 2020 and 2022 during the COVID pandemic. So you have these 2 crises, an implosion of the markets for 2 very different reasons. And in both of those cases, well, certainly in the first case, the working class people really struggled. And that's because of being evicted from their homes. You had inflationary trends in the housing market. They were not protected. And then in 2020, basically we revisit a crisis where the market shuts down immediately. And the federal government, and this is important to remind everyone watching this, the federal government intervened immediately, first and foremost, to save the American stock market. So in March of 2020, the S&P 500 dropped by well over 30%. And President Trump, in my view, did the right thing by buttressing the bond market. Had the bond market collapsed, the entire market in the United States would have collapsed, and we would have had another depression. So it's as if we've had 2 invisible depressions over a span of 20 years. And we have to get beyond the boom and bust period of economic development so that we can have economic growth in a sustainable way that benefits all.
Let's revisit something you mentioned a few minutes ago, and you called it campaign finance reform. So what kind of changes ought to be made there?
Well, I would first say that the Supreme Court ruling of Citizens United, which came down in the first quarter of 2010, if memory serves me, basically made all forms of corporate spending legal by how should I say, comparing political contributions to free speech. That was the argument. Okay. Now what we've seen since then, since 2010, is now 2024. So we've seen roughly 14 years of a massive increase in corporate investments, quote unquote, in the political process. And as the investments in PACs and super PACs increases, their hold on American politicians and public policy increases as well. And so this is a dangerous spiral. And it leads to millions of Americans, in my view, concluding that nothing will change, that the status quo cannot be reformed, and that money dominates American politics. And this is something, if we don't address in the near future, it could be really undermine our economy even further.
And what would the change look like specifically in your estimation to change that court ruling?
Well, the first thing is I don't think we should have PACs or super PACs at all, because these are opaque organizations which can raise hundreds of millions, in some cases billions of dollars of money from private sources which do not have to reveal themselves. So if you want to contribute to a campaign as an individual, your contribution is capped for a particular a given cycle at $3,300. A corporation can easily invest $300,000, $300 million if it so chooses, without revealing its identity.
Now, here's another priority that appeared on your website. It has to do with Social Security. And you noted that Republicans have tried to reduce or cut Social Security. And can you give an example of how they've done this? Because Republicans obviously can benefit from Social Security too, just like you and me.
Well, I think I want to distinguish, when you use the word Republicans, distinguish between Republican politicians and people, normal people like you and I, who may identify as Republicans or Democrats. So I meet Republican voters all the time. And I've never met a Republican voter who's tried to tell me or convince me that their parents or their uncles do not deserve to be on Social Security, that we should privatize it, or that Granny should be kicked off Medicare, and so on and so forth. You see the point. The Republican Party, however, from 1935 until just about a year ago, its official policy was, in effect, to privatize Social Security. And there have been several attempts. So George Bush II attempted to privatize Social Security after his re-election in 2004. It was top of agenda in 2005 to privatize Social Security, and fortunately he failed. There have been other attempts, some maybe more clever, and that is several leaders, including Donald Trump, have spoken openly of limiting or reducing payroll taxes, which of course finance Social Security. In my view, Social Security has to be protected, but also has to be expanded. And
expanded meaning what?
Expanding means, so basically, critics of Social Security will try to convince you that it's going to reach there's going to be a deficit in the next 10 years. There will be a shortfall if nothing is done. However, we know what can be done, and that is to lift the cap, to remove the cap on contributions that go to Social Security. So, as you know, payroll taxes, which come from the individual, that are dedicated to Social Security, I think it's about 6.5, 6.8%. I may have the exact figure wrong. And then there's a corresponding contribution from the employer. But it's limited. It doesn't cover all salary. It's limited. So someone who's a truck driver or a retail worker, a waitress, would make the full contribution. Someone who's making $10 million or $15 million would not. And so as a result, the percentage that they are paying on income earnings is absolutely negligible. And so in effect, it becomes almost a regressive tax. So the waitress is paying a higher percentage of her income than a Wall Street hedge fund manager. And I think that's wrong.
Let's talk about the incumbent in District 10, and that would be Scott Perry. How would you rate his performance?
Well, I don't really talk about him too much, only because I think Scott has already demonstrated he's a very poor congressman.
Give an example if you can.
Well, he doesn't advocate for the state. So Scott has been off the radar now for at least a year because he's under investigation for his collaboration and participation in the January 6th insurrection. And so as a result, he has not given any public appearances, or at least I have not heard of any. But I don't think this campaign is really about the incumbent. Because we know that the incumbent will simply fold and fall in line with MAGA extremists, whoever may be leading the party. It's not about him, it's really about us. And so what I'm trying to do in this campaign is I'm not telling voters to fear the incumbent or fear the Republican Party at the national level. I mean, Democrats have to give people a reason to vote. And so as a result, we have to tell them what we aim to do and what are the values we aim to defend. And that's what I'm trying to do in this campaign. Let's
turn to gun violence. What can be done to reduce it?
I think I'll start by saying, so I lived in China for many years, as you know, and I also worked a lot in Western Europe. And so I had clients who were in France and Spain, Italy, and the UK, etc. And wherever I went, in conversations with people, obviously, people want to know what's happening in the United States. And everyone raises the question, why in the world do you have assault weapons sold freely in the United States or machine guns in the United States? Why do you have so many mass murders in the United States? And there's nothing similar to this in other industrial countries, knock on wood. And the reason is because you do not have access to machine guns and assault weapons in France, Britain, Italy, or Spain. And so we know what can be done, and that is a complete ban on assault weapons. We know that it's effective because it was done for 10 years, starting in the Clinton years, the early Clinton years. And that ban was not renewed under George Bush Jr. And as a result, if you look at the statistics of mortality or deaths and severe injury due to mass attacks of people using assault weapons, there's a very steep drop-off as soon as the ban is put in place, and then an upward spike once the ban is released. So that's the number one priority, banning assault weapons.
How would you rate our government's handling of funding the war in Ukraine?
But before I talk about funding, I think we should talk about the very reason for it.
Go ahead.
What's the point? First of all, I think when Russia invaded Ukraine, it's a good example of, I think, failure of American intelligence. According to the New York Times, American intelligence that briefings that were given to President Biden suggested that the war would be over in a matter of weeks, 3 to 6 weeks. After that, of course, we were all very impressed by the great resistance of the Ukrainians. So I think President Biden did absolutely the right thing in funding the resistance and eventually in supplying military equipment. It's now reached the point, however, where a little over 2 years into this war, and it's become, it seems to me, a war of attrition. It seems, and several Ukrainian generals have said as much, that it's in effect a stalemate. And so in this situation, the United States, Ukraine, have to determine what is the path forward. Does the Ukraine have any reasonable chance of recovering, for example, the Crimea without suffering tremendous casualties and loss? As of today, it's the Ukrainians who are dying in this war. So I personally think that my political view is that we should continue to support the Ukraine, but that also that American diplomacy should always be focused on achieving security through diplomatic means.
What about support for Israel in the war with Hamas?
I want to start by saying first that the history of the Middle Eastern conflict does not begin on October 7th. We have at least 100 years of context of this conflict. And so I have condemned the terrorist attacks of October 7th. Joe Biden did as well. He expressed commiseration and support and empathy for the Palestinian civilian deaths after the reprisal and the attack by the Israeli Air Force and Army. But very quickly, I called for a ceasefire. Very, very quickly after the original incursion. And we've now reached the point where we have, as I understand it, at least 27,000 deaths in the Gaza Strip, 70% of whom are women and children. And so the entire planet, the entire world, sees the utter destruction of a territory which is only about 25 miles long and 7.5 miles wide. 2.3 million people, many of whom are refugees from previous wars. So I'm calling for an immediate ceasefire, and I'm very, very concerned about an escalation of the conflict.
To date, John, let's talk about your campaign. To date, how many candidate events or forums have you participated in?
Well, the candidate forum, there has only been one.
You got in the room with other Democrats, and of course there's
Yes.
a lot of overlapping of opinion there. So let me jump ahead and ask you, how can you distinguish yourself from other Democrats in the race?
Well, I think, first of all, I distinguish myself on the issue of peace and security in the Middle East. I do not want to have an escalation of the war in the Middle East, and I think we're already seeing it right now with military attacks in Yemen, in southern Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria. And I think we have to remind our viewers that we've lived through 20 years of so-called forever wars, disastrous invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, which totally dismantled the Middle East and created tremendous crisis and loss. I don't think anyone in the United States, anyone, is demanding more war.
We only have about 2 minutes left in our program, John, so why not use that remaining time to tell voters in District 10 why they should vote for you?
When you run for office with the intent to serve, to win an election and serve the public, it has to come at a time where you're personally ready to take on the challenge, personally and also intellectually ready to take on the challenge. And so I have been a student of American history my entire life, a student of world affairs my entire life, my years at Villanova till today. I think that in order to win this year, we have to address not the consequences of extremism, but the causes. And the causes are, in my view, extreme economic inequality that we have not fully addressed yet. The second cause is 20 years of failed, disastrous war, militarism. This is extremely important. And the third thing is a lack of political accountability. And when these three things come together, as they have over the past 20 years, it leads to feelings of social alienation, anger, resentment, hate, racism. And this is the fuel of extremism. So I'm trying to deal with causes, not consequences.
John Broadhurst, Democrat for Congress in District 10. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Larry.